The orange tabby finally crept close enough for Sophie to touch, and for one trembling second it looked like a miracle. But the moment her fingers brushed its matted fur, Margaret knew this was the worst thing that could have happened, because that cat had never let anyone near it in 18 years. And the foster system had no protocol for what it meant when a feral creature chose a child who had already been forgotten by everyone else. Sophie's social worker would later find her in the barn loft, the cat draped across her lap like a living wound, and that was the last time anyone saw either of them whole. The cat was a feral orange tabby that had been living in the barn of a farm that had stopped being a farm maybe 20 years ago. The foster placement was in a converted cottage on the same land, one of those arrangements where the council had decided that rural settings were therapeutic for children who'd never learned to trust adults. The theory wasn't wrong, exactly. It just wasn't complete. Sophie was 11 when she arrived. She'd been in 4 placements before this one, and the file the social worker brought was thick enough to be its own kind of warning. The foster carer, a woman named Margaret who'd been doing this work for 17 years, told the vet nurse that she'd expected the usual pattern, the testing, the acting out, the slow and careful building of something that might eventually look like stability. What she didn't expect was the cat. The cat had been there longer than anyone could remember. It lived in the loft of the old barn, in the space where hay had once been stored, and it came down only at night to hunt. Margaret had seen it maybe 3 times in 5 years, a flash of orange in the darkness, a shape that was gone before the eyes could focus. She'd left food out once, early on, and the bowl had stayed untouched for a week before she gave up. Some animals, she told herself, didn't want to be saved. The first time Sophie saw it was on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The light was that particular autumn gold that makes everything look like it's remembering something. Sophie was sitting on the stone wall that separated the cottage garden from the field beyond, and the cat emerged from the barn door, not fully, just enough to be seen. They stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, the girl and the cat, both perfectly still, both watching. Margaret watched from the kitchen window. She told the vet nurse later that she'd never seen Sophie hold still for that long before. The child was always moving, always shifting, always finding the edge of a room and pressing against it. But on that wall, in that light, she was as still as the stones beneath her. The next day, Sophie went back to the wall. The cat didn't appear. She went the day after that, and the day after that. On the 5th day, the cat was there again, in the barn doorway, watching. Sophie brought a piece of bread and left it on the wall before she went inside. The bread was still there the next morning. Jack noticed. Jack was the other foster child in the placement, 13 years old, and he had been with Margaret for nearly 2 years. He was the one who was supposed to be making progress. He was the one the social workers pointed to as proof that the system could work. And now there was this new girl, this quiet and watchful girl. And she was doing something he hadn't managed to do in all his time here, she was making the property's ghost into something real. You have to understand what that meant to a kid like Jack. He had been in care since he was 7. He had learned that attention was a finite resource, that love was something you had to earn and guard and fight for. Without a word, he had worked so hard to be the good one, the successful one, the one who justified the system's faith. And here was Sophie, who didn't seem to be working at anything at all, and the cat that had ignored him for 2 years was watching her from the barn door. The jealousy was quiet at first. It showed up in small ways, the way Jack would stand at the window when Sophie went to the wall. The way he stopped talking about his own day when Margaret asked, the way he started leaving the barn door open just a crack when he knew Sophie wasn't looking. Nothing cruel. Nothing that could be called out. Just the slow accumulation of a child's wounded logic, if I can't have this, maybe no one should. But Sophie kept going to the wall. She kept sitting in the same spot, at the same time, every afternoon, whether the cat appeared or not. She didn't call to it. She didn't make soft sounds or hold out her hand. She then just sat, and she waited, and she let the cat decide. The turning point came on the 17th day. Sophie had gotten into trouble at school for the first time, something about refusing to speak during a presentation. which the teacher had interpreted as defiance and which Sophie had experienced as a kind of paralysis. Margaret had handled it the way she handled everything, with a calm that was almost clinical, and Sophie had retreated to her room without dinner. But at dusk, she went to the wall anyway. Jack followed her. He told the social worker later that he hadn't planned it, that he had just wanted to understand what she was doing out there. He stood behind the corner of the cottage, where she couldn't see him, and he watched her sit on the wall with her arms wrapped around her knees. The cat came out of the barn. It was closer than it had ever been. It stopped maybe 10 feet from the wall, and in the fading light Jack could see details he had never noticed before, the way its ribs pressed against its fur. The torn edge of its left ear, the electric cobalt of its eyes in the dusk. It was starving. It was dying. And it was looking at Sophie like she was the first thing it had ever seen that made sense. Sophie didn't reach out. She didn't speak. She just sat there, and after what felt like forever, the cat sat down too. The real mistake here is thinking the cat was the problem. Look, the cat was just the excuse. What was really happening between Sophie and Jack was a question neither of them had the words for. Is there enough love left after you've been given up on? Sophie found her answer in the cat. Jack was still looking for his and Margaret's approval. That's the thing about kids in care, they're always calculating the odds of being kept. Jack watched for another minute before he went back inside. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. The social worker said later that this was probably the moment when Jack started to understand, but understanding and accepting are different things. That night, he took a piece of chicken from the fridge and left it on the stone wall after Sophie had gone to bed. The next morning, it was gone. That chicken, left in the dark for a creature that had never accepted anything from anyone, would become the first thread in a knot none of them could untangle. The daily ritual continued for another 3 weeks. Sophie would come home from school, change out of her uniform, and go to the wall. The cat would appear from the barn, sit at a distance, and watch. The gap between them got smaller by inches, not because Sophie moved closer, but because the cat did. One day it sat 5 feet away. Then 4. Then 3. Has a wild or wary animal ever slowly closed the distance to you like that cat did with Sophie, moving from 5 feet to 4 to 3, and what happened next? Then 1. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late November, the cat crossed the last space between them and pressed its head against Sophie's hand. Here's the beautiful part. Margaret was watching from the kitchen again, and she said later that Sophie didn't react at all for the first few seconds. She just sat there, her hand frozen, the cat's skull against her knuckles. And then, Margaret said this very carefully, like she was still trying to believe it, Sophie started to cry. Not the kind of crying that signals distress. The kind that happens when something you wanted so badly finally arrives and you don't know what to do with it. The cat stayed. It stayed for the whole afternoon. It stayed through dinner, sitting outside the kitchen window, its orange fur visible in the light from the stove. It stayed when Sophie went to bed, and in the morning it was on the stone wall again, waiting. Jack saw all of this. He saw the way Margaret's face changed when she talked about Sophie and the cat. He saw the way the social worker started using Sophie's progress as a new example in her reports. Slowly, he saw the cat, that impossible animal, sitting on the wall like it had always been a house pet. And he felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name. Have you ever watched someone get something you wanted, and realized, in the same moment, that you never really wanted it the way they did? That's what happened to Jack, or at least that's what he told the social worker. He said he watched Sophie with the cat and understood, for the first time, that love isn't something you compete for. It's something you either let happen or you don't. The cat's name was never decided. Sophie called it nothing at all, she just said, you, when she talked to it, and the cat seemed to know exactly who she meant. Margaret tried suggesting names once, and Sophie had looked at her with an expression that said some things don't need naming to be real. There are some bonds that don't need words to be understood. This was one of them. The crisis came in December. The cat got sick, whether from something it ate or something it had been carrying all along, nobody could tell. Sophie found it in the barn, barely moving, its breath shallow and its eyes half closed. She carried it to the cottage wrapped in her electric cobalt hoodie, the one she wore every day, and the cat didn't fight her. Margaret took one look at it and called the clinic. The vet nurse, the one who told me this story, was on duty that evening. She said she'd never seen a child arrive like that. Sophie didn't cry. She didn't explain. She just walked into the exam room holding the cat like it was made of glass, and she sat down on the floor against the wall, and she didn't move. The cat was in bad shape. Severe dehydration, an infection that had been building for weeks, a body that had stopped believing it could recover. The vet said the survival odds were maybe 40%, and that was being generous. They started treatment, and Sophie stayed. She stayed through the night. Margaret brought her a blanket and she wrapped it around herself, over the hoodie, and she stayed. She stayed through the next morning. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. Quietly, she just sat on the floor of the exam room, watching the cat breathe, watching the monitors, watching the vet's face for signs she didn't know how to read. Jack came with Margaret the next afternoon. The social worker had arranged transport, and Jack had asked to come. Not because he wanted to see the cat, he said. Because he wanted to be there for Sophie. The vet nurse told me that when Jack walked into the room, Sophie looked up at him and said something she had never said to anyone in the 11 months she'd been in placement. She said, "I think it's going to die." Jack sat down on the floor next to her. He didn't say it would be okay. He didn't say the cat would pull through. He then just sat there, on the electric blue linoleum of the exam room, and he waited with her. Sometimes the ones who need us most are the ones who can't ask. Sophie couldn't ask for Jack to stay. She couldn't ask for the cat to live. She couldn't ask for anything at all, and that was the whole problem. But Jack stayed anyway, and that was the first time in her life that someone had done that without being told. The cat survived. Just barely, and with a course of antibiotics that lasted 2 weeks, and with a feeding schedule that Sophie followed like it was the most important thing in the world. The vet said it was a miracle. The vet nurse said it was Sophie. The cat, when it was finally strong enough to leave the clinic, walked out of the carrier and straight to the stone wall, where it sat down and started cleaning its orange fur like nothing had happened. But the system doesn't account for miracles. The social worker came for a review meeting in January, and she brought the news that Sophie's placement was being reassessed. Should the social worker have prioritized the apparent bond between Sophie and the cat over standard placement review protocols? The foster care regulations had changed, the county had updated its policy on pets and placements, and the cat counted as an unregistered animal. Margaret's tenancy agreement didn't allow for pets without landlord approval, and the landlord had already said no. Sophie would have to choose, the placement, or the cat. She was 11 years old. The meeting happened in the cottage kitchen. The social worker sat at the table with her files and her forms and her rehearsed sentences about the best interests of the child. Margaret sat across from her, her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Jack stood by the window, watching the cat on the wall. And Sophie sat on the floor, her back against the cabinets, her knees drawn up to her chin. Here's where everything changes. Not when the decision gets made, but when you realize that no one in the room actually has the power to make the right one. The social worker had her policies. Margaret had her tenancy agreement. Jack had his silence. And Sophie had the cat, which was the only thing in her life that had ever looked at her and not asked for something in return. Because what happened next proved that a cat could do what no social worker, no foster carer, and no policy ever had. It chose Sophie, and that choice was the only thing that couldn't be undone. Sophie spoke first. She said, "If I go to another placement, will you take the cat to a rescue?" Margaret started to answer, but the social worker cut in. "Thing is," she explained, in that professional tone that tries to sound kind and ends up sounding like a door closing, that the cat wasn't the priority. That Sophie's stability was the priority. That the cat was a feral animal that had survived on its own before and would survive again. Sophie didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just looked at the social worker with an expression that the vet nurse described as the look of someone who has heard this exact speech before. From different people, about different things. She said, "So the answer is no." It wasn't a question. The cat stayed on the wall for 3 more days. Sophie sat with it every afternoon, and Jack sat with her now, and the 3 of them, the girl, the boy, and the orange cat with the torn ear, made a kind of silence that didn't need filling. Margaret watched from the kitchen, and the social worker filed her paperwork, and the landlord sent his letter, and the system did what the system does. On the last day, Sophie took the cat to the edge of the field. Not to the barn, but further, to where the land sloped down toward the stream. It was a warm afternoon for January, and the light was that particular golden hour shade that makes everything look like it's being remembered. Sophie sat down in the grass. The cat sat beside her. They stayed like that for a long time, the girl and the animal who had both been given up on by everyone who was supposed to believe in them. Jack watched from the cottage gate. He told the social worker later that he thought about going out there, but he didn't. He said some things need to happen without witnesses. When Sophie came back, the cat wasn't with her. She walked past Jack without stopping, went into the cottage, and closed her bedroom door. She didn't come out for dinner. Margaret left a plate outside the door, and it was still there in the morning. The cat came back to the wall the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Sophie didn't go to the wall again. She watched from the kitchen window, and the cat watched from the wall, and there was a distance between them that neither of them knew how to cross again. The placement ended in March. Sophie went to a group home in Stockport, and Jack stayed with Margaret. The social worker said it was the best available option. Margaret said nothing. Jack said nothing. The vet nurse told me she still sees the cat sometimes. It lives in the barn, still, and it still comes out at night to hunt. But sometimes, on warm afternoons, it sits on the stone wall and watches the cottage door. She said she doesn't know what it's waiting for. She said she thinks it knows. What strikes me about this story, looking back, is how nobody did anything wrong. That's the terrible part. The social worker followed policy. The landlord enforced his agreement. Margaret couldn't break her contract. The system functioned exactly the way it was designed to function, and somewhere in the middle of all that correct procedure. An 11-year-old girl learned that the one creature in the world who loved her without conditions wasn't allowed to stay. The vet nurse told me she thinks about Sophie sometimes, about that night in the exam room when the cat was dying and Sophie wouldn't leave. She said she's never seen a child hold that still for that long, waiting for something that might never come. She said it's a different kind of patience, the kind that knows there's no backup plan. I don't know where Sophie is now. The vet nurse didn't either. But I think about her, and about the orange cat on the stone wall, and about all the ways we tell children that love has limits. That belonging has conditions, that the ones who need most are the ones who deserve least. The cat still sits on the wall. That much is true. The vet nurse saw it last week when she drove past the cottage. It was there, orange in the afternoon light, watching the door. Maybe it's waiting. Maybe that's all any of us can do. That moment Sophie sat perfectly still on the wall. What made that cat finally come out? If this story made you ache with that quiet kind of hope, that's what the like button is for. If you've ever waited for someone who might never come back, this channel is where you belong.